I have kept a ledger my whole life. 2 columns worn soft at the corners. On the left, what I owe. On the right, what is owed to me. My father taught me to keep it because he said a man who forgets his debts becomes a liar without meaning to, and a man who forgets what he's owed becomes a fool. For 41 years, those 2 columns more or less balanced. Feed and fence, favors and grudges, a horse traded here, a hand of help there. Then came the winter. The snow gave me something I could never pay back. Not money, not a favor. A debt with no bottom to it, the kind you carry the way you carry a limp forever, quiet, part of how you walk now. I want to tell you about the woman I found in the drift below Cutter's Notch. I did not know her name when I found her. I did not know it for a long time after. What I knew was this. She had made a decision out there in the killing dark that most men would spend a whole life telling themselves they'd have made, and never, ever would. And the snow had covered it so gently, so completely, that if my dun horse hadn't shied at a shape in the white, I'd have ridden right past the bravest thing I have ever come near. The world would have gone on not knowing. That's the part that still wakes me, how close a thing like that comes to never being found. So sit close and let the fire do its work, because this one is going to cost you something before it's done. It cost me. I'm still paying. And by the time I finish, I think you'll understand why I finally, after all these years, opened the right-hand column, the owed to me column, and drew a line straight through it. Some things you don't get to be owed. Some things you just carry. Her name, when I learned it, was 3 soft sounds I still can't spell right. I'll give it to you at the end, when you've earned it the way I had to. Let me start where the snow started. The blizzard came down out of the north like it had a grudge. I'd seen bad weather. I'd buried cattle in it, buried a partner once, buried a good dog I loved better than most men. But the storm that dropped on the high country that February was a different animal. It didn't blow so much as lean, a solid, shouldering weight of wind that put its whole body against the cabin wall and pushed like it wanted in, like it was tired and cold too, and figured I owed it shelter. I counted the logs in the far wall while it did that. 19. I count things, always have. When my nerves get up on their hind legs, I put numbers to whatever's in front of me and it settles them back down. 19 logs, chinked with mud and horsehair and the wind finding every seam. I should have stayed in. Any man with sense would have stayed in. But I had 11 head of cattle unaccounted for since the day before the sky turned, and among them a heifer I'd hand-raised off a dead mother, a foolish, sentimental animal named Biscuit that would walk into a river if a leaf floated past her nose. In my ledger under owed, there was a line about Biscuit that I couldn't quite explain to another soul. You keep a thing alive with a bottle in your kitchen through a spring, and it stops being livestock. It becomes a small, stupid debt you pay by not letting it die of its own foolishness. So at first light, if you could call that gray, screaming murk light, I saddled the dun. His name was Marshall, and he had opinions. He gave me one when I cinched the girth, a long, ugly look over his shoulder that said, plain as speech, "You are the fool now." I told him he was probably right and gave him an extra minute at the grain. Then we went out into it. I want you to understand what that country is like when the snow owns it. You lose the world. Fence lines vanish. The trail you've ridden 10,000 times becomes a rumor. The land goes flat and blank and lying. A drift that looks like solid footing will swallow a horse to the chest, and a rise that should be there is scoured down to grass and ice. You navigate by things you feel more than see. The set of the wind, the lean of a particular dead pine. The way the ground drops toward the creek, even under 4 feet of white. I found 3 head in the lee of a rock shelf, huddled and rimed with frost but alive, their breath making little ghosts that the wind tore apart. Not Biscuit. I hazed them toward home ground and kept on, up toward Cutter's Notch, because that's where a foolish animal chasing warmth would drift, up the draw, toward the notch, toward nothing. The cold was a living thing by mid-morning. It got into the seams of my coat. It found the old frostbite in my 2 smallest fingers on the left hand, a gift from a winter 20 years gone, and set them aching in that deep, dead way, the ache of nerves that never quite healed and never quite quit complaining about it. I flexed them against the reins, counted the fence posts I passed when the fence appeared, 14 before it disappeared again under a drift. That's when Marshall stopped. He didn't shy, not at first, he just planted. Ears hard forward, whole body gone rigid under me, that particular stillness a good horse gets when it has decided something in the landscape is wrong, and it is not going one more step until you deal with it. I looked where he looked. At first I saw only white. The draw below the notch, filled and smoothed by 2 days of snow, a long, clean slope of it running down into the shadow of the rocks. Then I saw the shape. It wasn't much. A darker place in the whiteness, low, maybe 100 yards off and downslope. It could have been a rock. It could have been a deadfall. It could have been one of my own cattle, gone down and dying. The wind was throwing snow across it in long veils, so that it seemed to breathe, appear, vanish, appear. And something about that flicker put the hairs up on my neck under 3 layers of wool. I told myself it was a rock. I have thought a great deal since about the man I was in that moment, about how badly I wanted it to be a rock, about how a rock owes you nothing and asks nothing and lets you turn your horse home to your fire with a clean conscience. There's a version of me that told himself the lie and rode on and never knew. He lives easier than I do, that man. He sleeps. I hope I never meet him because I think I'd hate his face. I got down. Marshall wouldn't go closer, so I left him ground-tied and broke a path down the slope on foot, and it was brutal work, the snow to my thighs and hiding holes and hummocks, and twice I went in over my waist and had to claw out. The wind wanted to turn me. My own breath froze on my beard and the muffler and made a mask of ice over my mouth. By the time I got within 30 feet, I was blowing like a spent horse, and I stopped, and I looked, and I understood that it was not a rock. It was a mound, a made thing. Somebody had built it. Even under the fresh snow, you could see the intent in it, a low wall of packed drift, curved, shaped by hands into a kind of shelter against the north wind. Its open mouth turned south and downslope, away from the worst of the blow. A snow den. I'd heard old-timers talk about digging in like that to ride out weather, but I'd never seen it done, and never done it myself. And the sheer competence of it, the skill, stopped me cold in a way the weather hadn't. And there, at the mouth of it, half standing, half fallen, frozen into the very posture of guarding the opening with her own body, was a woman. I want to tell this part right, because I have told it wrong before, to make it easier on the listener, and I'm done doing that. She had put herself in the doorway. That was the thing I understood before I understood anything else about her. She hadn't crawled inside where it was warmest. She had wedged her own body across the low opening, curled around it, her back to the wind and her front to the shelter, so that she was the wall. So that whatever the north wind wanted, it had to come through her first. She was Apache. I knew that much at a glance, the cut of what she wore, deerskin and wool and a blanket coat gone stiff as board, the 2 long braids frozen solid and white-crusted, the beadwork on a strap across her chest that even under all that ice threw back a little dull color, red and white and a blue like old sky. Her face was turned partly toward me. Young. Not a girl, a woman grown, with a strong, straight nose and a scar through one eyebrow, and cheeks the wind had burned dark and then bloodless. Her eyes were closed. There was frost on her lashes, each one picked out white, and I remember thinking, in the strange, flat way the mind works at such moments, that it was almost beautiful, and hating myself for the thought. Her hands, God, her hands were bare. She had been wearing mittens, I found one later, jammed into the snow wall as chinking, plugging a gap where the wind was finding its way through to whatever was inside. She had taken the covering off her own hands to seal her shelter tighter. Her fingers were curled and dark, and I did not need to be a doctor to know what the cold had done to them. She had given her hands to the wall. I got to her. I said something, I don't know what, some broken, useless thing, hey, hey now, hey, the way you gentle a spooked animal. And I put my mittened hand to her frozen cheek, and it was like touching stone that had once been warm. No pulse at her throat that I could find through my own numb fingers, nothing at her wrist. The stillness of her was total, and it was old, hours old, and I knelt there in the snow beside her with the wind screaming, and I felt the whole bottom drop out of the day. Too late, I was too late. Whatever had happened here had finished happening while I was still arguing with my horse about grain. And then from inside the mound, small and thin, and threaded through the wind so that at first I thought I'd made it up out of grief and cold. A cough. I have heard a lot of sounds in my life. I have heard a woman cry over a grave and a man scream under a fallen wagon and the long, lonely talk of wolves working a ridge in the dark. I have never in my life heard anything that reordered the whole world the way that small, wet cough did. It went through me like a current. I damn near fell over. I tore at the snow, clawed it through it, dug into the mouth of that shelter with both arms like a dog after a badger. And I was shouting now, shouting I'm here, hold on, to whatever was in there. And the packed snow came away in slabs, and then I could see into the dark curve of it. And there was a child. A boy, small, 4 years old, maybe 5, hard to say, all of them look younger, half frozen. He was wrapped. That's the word I keep landing on. Wrapped, cocooned, bound up in every scrap of covering that woman had owned. Her blanket coat off her own back around him twice. A wool shawl. The deerskin that should have been her leggings. Even the second mitten, the one that wasn't in the wall, jammed onto one of his small feet like a boot. She had stripped herself down to almost nothing and packed every thread of it around this child. And then she had lain across the door and become a wall against the wind. And she had done all of it knowing. She had to have known exactly what it would cost her. The boy was alive, barely. His lips were gray, and his eyes were half open and wandering, and he didn't cry, didn't reach for me, was too far gone toward the long, cold sleep to do more than cough again and shudder. But he was breathing. There was still a small furnace burning in that little body, and she had spent her own to keep it lit. I did not think. There wasn't any thinking left in me. I got him out of that hole and against my chest, inside my coat, this cold, rigid little bundle that weighed nothing, and I felt him there against my heart, and I said out loud to nobody, to the storm, to her, "I've got him. I've got him. You hear me? I've got him." She didn't hear me. I knew that. But I said it anyway, and I've never once regretted saying it, because it was the only thing I had to give her, and I gave it. Getting back up that slope with a dying child inside my coat and a storm trying to kill us both is a thing I'll spare you the full telling of, because it was mostly just refusing to fall over and over 100 times, each step a separate argument with the snow. My legs went. My lungs burned. The frostbit fingers on my left hand stopped hurting, which frightened me worse than the pain had. I counted my steps because it was the only thing holding my mind together. 1, 2, 3, and lose count at 40 and start again. And somewhere in there, I made a bargain with a god I hadn't spoken to honestly in a decade. And the bargain was simple. Let this one live and you can have whatever's left of me. Marshall was still there. Good horse, best horse. He stood like a rock and let me half fall into the saddle with the boy against me. And he found the way home when I could no longer find it myself, walking sure through white nothing. And I bent my whole body over that child to shield him from the wind, and I talked to him the entire way. Nonsense. Everything. My own name, the names of my cattle, the fact that I had a warm stove and a bottle of good whiskey, and a debt to pay, and I was by God going to pay it on his warm, living body if it was the last thing my hands ever did. I did not go back for her. I want that on the record in the left-hand column under what I owe. I left her in the snow. There was a living child freezing against my heart and a dead woman behind me, and the math of it was cruel and clear, and I made the only choice a man could make, and I have never forgiven myself for it anyway. Both those things are true. They sit in me side by side and they don't cancel out. You'd think one would. It doesn't. We made the cabin near dark. I don't fully remember it, the door, the heat, the way the room swam. I remember stripping that boy down and wrapping him in every blanket I had that was warm off my own bed. I remember not putting him near the stove, because some old-timer's voice in my head said slow, warm him slow, or his heart'll stop, and I remember warming water and soaking cloths and pressing them to his little chest, his armpits, the pulse of his thin neck, changing them as they cooled. I remember my own dead fingers fumbling and failing and me cursing them and using the good hand. I remember the moment his eyes found mine, really found them, focused. 2 dark, frightened eyes and a small gray face looking up at this huge frost-bearded stranger who had him, and the fear in them, the raw animal fear of a child among strangers with his whole world gone, that fear is a thing I'd have given 10 years of my life to spare him. He didn't know me. He didn't know where he was. He didn't know, God help him, that the wall of warmth he'd been living inside had a name and a face, and had loved him enough to become weather. He didn't cry. That's what undid me, finally. A child that age, that frightened, and he didn't cry. He just looked at me with those enormous eyes and pressed his lips together tight, the way she must have taught him, the way you teach a child who has to be quiet to survive. And I understood that this small person had already, in his short life, learned the terrible discipline of silence, and I turned my face away so he wouldn't see a grown man come apart. Outside, the storm went on all night. It sang against my 19 logs. It leaned its cold body on the walls and pushed. And out below Cutter's Notch in the dark, the snow was already doing what snow does, softening the shape she'd made of herself, filling in the doorway she'd guarded, smoothing her back down into the white, patient and gentle and complete, hiding what she'd done as thoroughly as if it had never happened at all. I sat up with the boy against my chest, And I watched the fire, and I made him a promise I had no right to make and no idea how to keep. I promised him I'd find out who she was. I promised him the snow wasn't going to get to keep her. The boy lived. I'll give you that now up front, because I remember what it was to not know, and I won't do that to you. He lived. But living, it turned out, was only the first of the things that winter asked of both of us, and it was nowhere near the hardest. For 3 days I didn't leave the cabin. Couldn't the storm saw to that, and wouldn't have if I could. He ran a fever that second night that had me sponging him down and praying and cursing in equal measure, and there was an hour before dawn where his breathing went so shallow and so far apart that I held my own breath in the gaps, waiting each time to see if the next one would come. It came. Every time it came. That child had a will in him that I think he learned at the knee of the woman in the snow, and it did not know how to quit. He didn't speak, not that whole first stretch. He watched me, those dark eyes following me around the room, wary, always wary, flinching if I moved too quick. And he took the broth I made him, and he let me warm him, but he didn't make a sound beyond that terrible, quiet coughing. I started to wonder if the cold had taken something from him, or if the fear had, or if he simply had no words I'd understand. So I talked enough for both of us. I told him my name, Emmett. I said over and over, Emmett, tapping my own chest, and I named everything in the room for him, the stove and the kettle and the lamp, and I sang the 2 songs I knew all the way through and hummed the parts of others I'd forgotten. I told him about Marshall and about Biscuit, who I never did find, and whose empty line in my ledger I have never had the heart to cross out. I filled that little cabin with the sound of a human voice, because I did not know what else to give a child who had lost the one voice that was his. On the 3rd day the wind died. I woke to a silence so total it frightened me more than the storm had. I lay in the gray light and listened to nothing. No wind, no logs creaking, just the small even breathing of the boy in the nest of blankets beside my cot. And I got up and opened the door onto a world made new and blinding and cruel in its beauty. Snow to the eaves. Sky a hard scrubbed blue. Everything sharp and clean and silent, and somewhere out there under all that perfect white a woman. I had to go get her. You understand that. There are things a man doesn't leave for the spring melt and the coyotes to find. I'd made her a promise, and even a promise made to the dead is still a line in the left-hand column, and I pay my debts. But I couldn't take the boy back to that place, and I couldn't leave him alone, and I couldn't ask a soul for help because the nearest neighbor was Halloran, 9 miles east, and Halloran was, well, I'll get to Halloran. In the end, I bundled the boy up, better than she'd had to, in my own warmest things cut down and pinned to fit, and I put him up on Marshall in front of me, and we rode the 9 miles to Halloran's because there was a woman there. Halloran's wife, Ada. A hard woman married to a hard man, but I'd seen her nurse a stranger through fever once with her own hands, and I judged, rightly, as it turned out, that whatever was ungentle in her did not extend to a frightened child. That ride is where the world started showing me its other face. I've lived a long time among decent people, and I forget, sometimes, what runs under the decency, until something scratches the surface and it comes up. When I carried that boy into Halloran's kitchen and set him down and told them, plainly, what I'd found, the shelter, the woman, the way she'd stripped herself bare to wall him in, I watched Halloran's face, and I watched it not soften. I watched it do the opposite. "Apache," he said. Just the one word. And the way he set it down on the table between us told me everything about the shape of the next few years of my life. "A woman," I said, "and her boy, and she died out there keeping him alive, and I'll thank you two." "Whose boy?" Halloran said. "You know that's her boy. You know she didn't take him off some poor family, she and her people." I don't remember standing up. I remember Ada's hand flat on my chest, pushing me back down into the chair, and her voice low, and even saying my name, Emmett, Emmett, sit, and the boy. The boy had gone rigid and silent and small in the corner where I'd set him, reading the anger in the room the way children read weather, and that, more than Halloran's ugly mouth, is what put me back in my seat. I would not fight over that child's head. I would not make my rage the loudest thing in the room he was trying to survive in. Ada took the boy. God bless her for it, whatever else she was. She took him and warmed milk and sat with him and did not ask him a single question, and within the hour he was asleep against her shoulder, worn out from fear, and she looked at me over his dark head and said, quiet, "Go get her then, before more weather. We'll mind him." So I went, alone, Back up the long white miles to Cutter's Notch, and it took me the better part of a day to find the place again, because the snow had done its work so well that there was nothing to mark it. No mound, no shelter, no shape. Just a smooth slope of white below the rocks, unbroken, innocent, as if I'd dreamed the whole thing. I found her by the one thing the snow couldn't quite hide, a corner of that beaded strap, red and white and old sky blue, showing through the drift where the wind had scoured a hollow. I dug her out with my hands and a broke branch, and I did it slow and careful, and I will not tell you the particulars of that hour because they belong to her and not to you. I'll tell you only that when I got her free and turned her over, her face had thawed and frozen and thawed again, and it was peaceful, not tortured, peaceful. She had made her choice all the way down to the bottom of it, and there was no fight left unfinished in that face. She had known what she was doing, and she had done it on purpose, and she had, I believe, been at peace with it before the end came. I wrapped her in my own bedroll, and I got her across Marshall's withers. He didn't like it, but he's a good horse, I've said, and I walked her down. 9 miles I walked, leading the horse, because it didn't seem right to ride while she rode dead. And somewhere on that long white walk I started, without meaning to talk to her. The way I'd talked to the boy. I told her about him. I told her he'd lived, that he was warm, that he was safe with a hard woman who had a soft place she kept hidden. I told her I didn't know her name, but I meant to learn it. I told her, and this is the part I've never told another living soul until now, I told her I was sorry I'd left her in the snow that first night, and I asked her, out loud in the empty white, to understand. And I swear to you the silence that answered wasn't an empty silence. It was a full one, the kind that has already forgiven you and is only waiting for you to forgive yourself. I never learned who she'd been running from, not for certain, but I learned enough to piece it. It came in fragments over the following weeks from a trader named Fessler who moved through that country and knew things, and from an old scout who'd married into the tribes, and from what the boy himself finally told me when the words came back to him, which they did, slow, in a mix of his tongue, and the English he picked up faster than any child I ever saw. Here is what I put together, and here is where I'll admit I'm guessing at the seams. There had been sickness, a fever that came through a winter camp and took the old and the young first, the way it always does. This woman, the boy's aunt, it turned out, his mother's sister, not his mother, which somehow made it worse and made it larger all at once, had taken the surviving children out. Away from the sickness, toward a place east where kin were said to be, over the high country in the wrong season, because the wrong season and a chance was better than the right season and none. There had been more than one child at the start. I made myself stop asking, at a certain point, what happened to the others on that crossing, because the boy's face when the question came near it was a thing no child should have to make, and I decided some accounts are better left unbalanced. She'd gotten him this far, to Cutter's Notch, one ridge and one storm short of the descent to the eastern valleys where there'd have been shelter and people and warmth. So close. When the blizzard caught them, she'd done the one competent, doomed, magnificent thing left to do. She dug in, and built the wall, and given him everything she had, layer by layer, her coat and her leggings and her mittens, and finally her own body and her own warmth and her own breath, spending herself down to nothing over the course of a long, dark night, so that a small furnace of a boy could go on burning. She'd have known, digging that shelter, that there wasn't enough warmth in it for two. That's the part I keep coming back to. She'd have known the arithmetic of it, cold and exact, that everything she gave him was subtracted from herself, and that when the sums were done, only one of them would see the morning. And she did the sums, and she chose which one, and she never once, I'd stake my life on this, she never once considered choosing the other way. That is not a thing that happens by accident. That is not instinct or panic or the blind flailing of a cornered animal. That is a decision. The heaviest decision a soul can make, made alone in the dark, in the cold, with no one watching and no one who would ever know, made for a child who was too far gone to even understand he was being saved. The snow had hidden it, would have hidden it forever. And I have thought more times than is good for me about all the shelters like hers that the snow did keep, all the quiet, enormous sacrifices out in that white country that no shying horse ever pointed a man toward, that no one ever dug up, that are still out there, held in the cold, waiting for a spring that just makes them disappear. The world is fuller of heroes than we will ever know. Most of them the snow keeps. I got to find one, just one. And even finding one has been almost more than I could carry. We buried her on my land. The ground was iron hard, and it took me 2 days with a fire to thaw it and a pick to break it. And Ada came, and even Halloran came at the end and stood with his hat in his hands, silent, which from Halloran was a whole apology he'd never say out loud. The boy stood at the graveside wrapped in my coat, and he did not cry that discipline again, that terrible taught quiet, but he put something in the grave before I filled it. The beaded strap. He'd worked it loose from her, and he laid it in with her, red and white and old sky blue, and he said a word over her in his own tongue, low, and I didn't ask him what it meant. That night back in the cabin, warm, the boy asleep, I got out my ledger. I sat with it a long time. I looked at the two columns, what I owe, what is owed to me. 41 years of careful accounts, more or less balanced, the way my father taught me. And I found I couldn't write anything. There was no line I could draw that made sense. What do you put in the ledger for a woman who gave a child the world at the cost of leaving it? Which column does that go in? She owed me nothing. I owed her everything. But everything isn't a number, and a debt you can't number is a debt you can't pay, and a debt you can't pay isn't really a debt at all anymore. It's just love, I think, is what it becomes. Love with nowhere to go but forward into the next person and the next. I closed the ledger without writing in it, first time in my life. Then I sat and watched the boy sleep, his chest rising and falling, that small furnace still burning, and I understood that she'd handed him to me the way you hand someone the last of your fire, and that what I did with it now was the only accounting that was ever going to matter. Here is the part nobody warns you about. The rescue is the easy story. The rescue has an ending, a warm cabin, a living child, a grave with something beautiful buried in it. People like the rescue. They lean in for the rescue. What they don't lean in for, what nobody puts in the ballads, is the 10,000 ordinary mornings that come after, when the hero is in the ground, and the miracle is a small, stubborn boy who wets the bed and won't eat his eggs and wakes screaming from the cold in his dreams. And there's no snow to blame anymore, no storm to be brave against, just the long, undramatic work of raising a life somebody died to hand you. I was 41, and I had never raised anything but cattle and a bad temper. I knew nothing. I did everything wrong. I want to be honest about that, because the story where the gruff old rancher magically becomes a natural father is a lie, and I promised you I was done with the lies that make things easy. I burned his eggs. I put his shirt on backwards for a month before Ada, laughing, showed me the difference. I lost my temper once, just once, over something so small I can't even remember it now, a spilled thing, a broken thing, and I raised my voice, and I watched that boy fold down into himself and go silent and still the way he'd gone in Halloran's kitchen, and I understood in one gut-hollowing instant exactly what I was capable of undoing. I got down on the floor. I got down on my knees on the cold plank floor to be small, to be below him, and I said I was sorry, and I said it in the three broken sounds of her name because I wanted him to know that whatever she'd been to him, I was trying, however badly, to stand in that place. He came to me. He put his small hand flat on my rough cheek, the way I'd first touched hers in the snow, and something passed between us that I don't have words for and won't insult by reaching for them. He grew. That's the plain wonder of it. He grew. The gray went out of his lips and the wariness came slow out of his eyes, not all the way, never all the way. There's a watchfulness in him to this day that the storm put there and I could never take out, but enough. Enough that he laughed. The first time I heard it, I stopped dead in the yard like I'd been struck. A child's laugh, real and helpless and bright, out of that grave quiet boy, and I had to go stand behind the barn a minute and get a hold of myself. I put a line in the ledger that day. The only line I put in for years. Right-hand column owed to me, and what I wrote was, nothing, paid in full. Because that laugh cleared every debt I'd ever thought the world owed me, all at once, and I've never been able to feel poorly used by life since. You cannot be owed anything by a world that hands you a dead woman's fire and lets you watch it laugh. I taught him what I knew, cattle and horses and the lean of the land, and how to read weather so that no storm would ever catch him the way it caught her. He taught me things too, words in his tongue, ways of seeing that country that I'd ridden for 20 years and never once truly looked at. He kept her memory in ways I couldn't. Songs, a way of turning to face the mountains at certain hours. Once a year, the strap, he beaded a new one when his hands were old enough. Patient work over a whole winter, red and white and old sky blue, and he wears it still, and when I see it my throat closes every time. Halloran came around. People do mostly, given time and a child's laugh to shame them. By the time the boy was 10, there wasn't a family in that country would say a word against him, and the few that tried found out that Emmett Cade, who'd kept to himself for 40 years, had grown some teeth. I made enemies defending him. I'd make them again. They're the only debts I've ever been glad to owe. But I won't tell you it all came right, because it didn't, not all of it, and you'd know I was lying. There was a distance in him I never crossed. A room in that boy the storm had built and locked, and I stood at the door of it his whole growing up and was never once let in, and I stopped, eventually, trying the handle. There are things that happened on that crossing to the other children, to the woman in that long last night in the snow, that he carried alone and would not set down, not for me, not for anyone, and I had to learn the hardest thing a person who loves another person can learn, which is that some griefs are not yours to fix, and the loving thing, the only loving thing, is to sit beside the locked door and not go away. So I sat. Years I sat. I'm still sitting. He left in the end, they do. He grew tall and quiet and strong, and he had questions about his own people that I couldn't answer and had no right to. And when he was 17, he went east and then north, looking for the kin she'd died trying to reach, and I put him on a horse. Not Marshall. Marshall was long gone by then, but a good grandson of Marshall's, and I watched him ride out into country I couldn't follow him into. And it was the second time in my life I stood in that yard and felt the whole bottom drop out of the day. He comes back. That's not a small thing, and I won't pretend it is. Not often and not for long, but he comes back, and we sit at the grave, and we don't say much. And once he told me the only time either of us ever said the thing straight out, he told me she'd have been glad it was me the horse shied at. That out of every man who might have ridden past that shape in the white, it was one who'd stop and dig. I didn't trust my voice to answer him. I put my hand on the strap on his chest, red and white and old sky blue, and he let me, and that was the answer. I'm an old man now. Older than I ever thought I'd get, and most of that owed to a decision a dying woman made in the dark that has never once stopped rippling outward. Every good thing in the back half of my life traces back to 100 yards of hard snow and a horse with better sense than his rider. I think about that a great deal. How the whole shape of a life can turn on whether you make yourself get down and walk toward the thing you're praying is only a rock. I got my ledger out again tonight. Last time I'll write in it, I think. My hands aren't good anymore, the frostbit fingers finally won, and the others aren't far behind, but I managed. I turned to the front, where my father's hand still shows in the old accounts, and I turned through 40 years of my own, feed and fence, favors and grudges, all of it so small now, so small, and I came to the blank pages at the back that I never filled. And on the very last one I wrote the only thing I've got left to say that matters.